Montreal, 1995. The red Ferrari 412 T2 screams out of the final chicane. V12 howling. Grandstands on the feet. Jean Alesi crossed the line to win his very first Grand Prix on his 31st birthday. And then the Ferrari coughs, stutters, and dies on the cool-down lap. Out of fuel. The crowd is still losing its mind while Alesi, who has spent 6 years throwing everything at Formula One, is sat in a silent Ferrari rolling to a halt. Michael Schumacher pulls alongside, offers him a lift back to the pits, and Alesi climbs onto the side pod, waving at the fans like a folk hero who's just stolen his one happy ending from a universe that usually said, "Not today." That image sums up Jean Alesi. Beautiful, chaotic, emotional, and never quite in the right car at the right time. 1 victory, 32 podiums, 2 pole positions, 201 starts. A career that on paper looks like a solid journeyman, but if you watched him, if you felt the same way he drove, you know that paper lies. This is a story of the man who made Senna sweat, who turned the number 27 Ferrari into a rolling tribute act to Gilles Villeneuve, and who may be the purest case of all the talent and none of the luck that Formula One has ever seen. Jean Alesi was born in Avignon on the 11th of June 1964 to Sicilian parents. His dad Franco ran a panel beating and bodywork shop, and the smell of filler and petrol was basically Jean's childhood perfume. Whilst most French kids dreamed of Le Mans or the Tour de France, Jean was in love with rally. He grew up watching his father and family friend Jean Ragnotti fling cars along hill climbs and special stages, and that's where his sense of car control was born. He came to karting relatively late, 16 years old, but once he put that helmet on, the trajectory sharpened fast. From karts he jumped into the French Renault 5 Turbo Cup in 1983, and then French Formula Renault, learning the craft the hard way in fiercely contested national series. In 1987 he exploded onto the radar, French Formula 3 champion with Oreca, 7 wins, plus victory at the Monaco F3 Grand Prix, the junior race that always seems to foreshadow who really has something special. From there it was International Formula 3000, the brutal finishing school of that era. His first season in 1988 was messy, only 10th in the standings, but in 1989 he joined Eddie Jordan's Formula 3000 team and everything clicked. 3 wins, the title on countback against Eric Comas, and suddenly the F1 paddock stopped treating him as a promising French lad and started asking, how soon can we get him in a Grand Prix car? The answer came in the most late 80s way possible, a cigarette war. Tyrrell had just signed Camel sponsorship, which clashed with Michele Alboretto's personal Marlboro deal. Somebody had to go. And Ken Tyrrell looked at the Formula 3000 points table, saw who was leading, and picked up the phone. Alesi debuted at his home race, the 1989 French Grand Prix, in a Tyrrell that wasn't exactly front-running material, and he promptly finished 4th, running as high as 2nd. Ken gave him an 18-month contract on the spot. However, if you want the moment the legend of Jean Alesi really began, you have to go to Phoenix, Arizona, March 1990. Street circuit, manhole covers, concrete, and an early season belief that McLaren and Ayrton Senna would crush everyone as usual. Alesi, in a customer engine Tyrrell, launched from 4th on the grid, dived past Gerhard Berger, and then Senna into turn 1 and led the race. And not for a lap, not on strategy, he led on outright pace from the front. Senna hunted him down, passed him, and Alesi immediately dummied back and retook the lead at the next corner. They ran wheel to wheel, the world champion in a Works Honda V10 fighting a kid in a Tyrrell Ford. The second time Senna attacked, he made it stick, and Alesi finally had to yield and settle for second. But the message was clear. He wasn't scared. He wasn't overawed. He'd just taken the fight to Ayrton Senna in just his 6th Grand Prix on a street circuit in a midfield car. After the race, Senna said he knew Alesi had the ingredients to be world champion, and Alesi, still buzzing, called Senna his hero. That Phoenix drive, followed by another second place in Monaco, turned him into the hottest property for 1990. Frank Williams wanted him, Benetton wanted him, Tyrrell wanted to hang on to him, and Ferrari, with Prost and Mansell on the books, were watching closely. The contract situation turned into a full-blown saga. Alesi actually signed a deal with Williams for 1991, but as the team hesitated, flirting with the idea of poaching Senna, Ferrari stepped in with a full works offer. Feeling strung along by Williams and seduced by the red cars he'd grown up adoring, Alesi tore up the Williams deal and signed for Maranello. On paper it made sense. Prost had nearly won the title for Ferrari in 1990. The 1991 car looked quick in winter testing. For a kid who'd grown up idolising Ferrari, and who now had a contract to race alongside Alain Prost, it was the heart's choice and the head's, at least in the moment. History, though, would be brutally unkind to that decision. The Ferrari years from 1991 to 1995 are the spine of Alesi's legend, and of his tragedy. In 1991, he was the junior partner to Prost. The car was fast but fragile, the famous V12 screaming, but the gearbox and electronics letting him down far too often. He picked up podiums at Monaco, Hockenheim and Estoril, but also racked up 9 retirements. There's a version of that season where the Ferrari hangs together and Alesi becomes a multiple race winner, but we didn't get that version. In 1992, Ferrari collapsed. The F92A was a dog, a complicated, aerodynamically ambitious car that simply didn't work. Alesi drove the wheels off it anyway. 4th in Mexico, a fabulous wet weather podium in Spain where he somehow coaxed the car around despite contact and chaos, and a 3rd at Monaco, muscling the unwielding Ferrari through the streets while the Williams and Benetton brigade did their thing up front. The Tifosi loved him for it. He committed everything, every lap, even when there was no realistic prospect of a win. By 1993 and 1994, Ferrari were clawing their way back, and Alesi was the emotional centre of that fight. He took pole at Monza in 94, the Tifosi losing their minds as the number 27 sat alone at the top of the timesheets. In the race he led, looked capable of a fairy tale home win, but then the gearbox failed in the pit lane. In fury and heartbreak, Alesi drove all the way back to Avion that evening at insane speed, the only sort of thing that Jean would admit later with a sheepish grin. But that was Alesi. If the car broke, his emotions didn't. He wore them all, and always, in public. The comparison everyone made during these years was Gilles Villeneuve. The number 27 on the door, the scything sideways style, the refusal to back off even when logic said, settle for second. Ferrari were unreliable, sometimes poorly managed, often outdeveloped, but Alesi kept delivering the moments. Wet weather charges, qualifying laps that didn't make sense, overtakes from nowhere. It wasn't consistent enough to win the titles, but it was irresistible to watch. All of that built to Montreal, June 1995. Ferrari were finally getting themselves together. Alesi was turning 31. Schumacher's Benetton and Hill's Williams were still the class of the field, but on that Sunday in Canada, the cards fell Jean's way. He took the lead when Schumacher hit trouble, and then spent the closing laps nursing the car, nervous about reliability and haunted by every lost opportunity of the previous 5 years. When the Ferrari crossed the line and actually survived long enough to take the flag, the entire circuit erupted. This was no tactical masterclass, no dominant win. It was a release valve for half a decade of near misses. The engine then ran out of fuel, which felt about right. That would be his only Grand Prix victory. Alesi holds the joint record for most podiums before his first win, 15, and he would stand on the rostrum 32 times. But Montreal 95 was his lone taste of champagne from the top step. At the end of the 1995 season, the carousel turned again. Schumacher left Benetton for Ferrari, and Alesi and Berger went the other way, in a seat swap. On paper, Alesi was jumping into the reigning Constructors' Champions. In reality, just as Ferrari rose, Benetton dipped. A lot of key personnel, including technical mastermind Rory Byrne, either moved to Ferrari or stepped away. The 96 Benetton was still quick enough for podiums, and Alesi took plenty of them, including a string of second places that hinted at more. But wins refused to come. Mistakes, strategy calls, the occasional flash of over-aggression, and a subtle but important shift. With Schumacher now turning Ferrari into his personal empire, Alesi found himself in the wrong comparison. Yeah, he was quick. Yes, he was entertaining. But he wasn't the remorseless points machine that Schumacher had been in the same seat. When Benetton slipped backwards in 1997 and failed to renew his contract, it was another sliding doors moment that fell on the wrong side of Jean. From there, his F1 career moved into the survivor phase. 2 seasons at Sauber gave him something different, but he was no longer expected to win, just to drag a car into the places it maybe didn't belong. He still managed a brilliant podium at Spa in 1998 in the madness of that rain-soaked classic, surviving the carnage to take third for a midfield team. It was classic Alesi, in the wet, in the chaos, when everyone else was just trying to keep it pointing vaguely forwards. He looked like he was dancing. A move to Prost Grand Prix in 2000, pairing with Alain Prost's team owner rather than his teammate, looked romantic on the surface, but quickly curdled. The cars were slow, the Peugeot engines unreliable, and for the first time in his F1 career, Alesi went a full season without scoring a point. He railed against the machinery, the politics, the lack of progress. There were still flashes of speed, but they were buried under frustration. In 2001, Prost built a more reliable car, and Alesi finished every race he started for them, a weird statistical quirk after all those mechanical failures at Ferrari. But money was tight, and by mid-season, he moved across to Jordan to replace Heinz-Harald Frentzen. It gave him one last run in vaguely competitive machinery, but by then, the sport was different. Schumacher and Ferrari were in full control, and the midfield was a knife fight he no longer had the tools to win. He bowed out at the end of 2001. His last race, the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, the same track where his heroics for Ferrari had often gone unrewarded. Retirement from F1, however, didn't mean retirement from driving. Alesi headed to DTM, the German touring car series, in 2002. In those snarling Mercedes C-Class weapons, elbow to elbow with other ex-F1 names, he rediscovered something close to joy. Over 5 seasons, he took 5 wins and 8 podiums, finishing as high as 5th in the championship. It wasn't the global spotlight of Formula 1, but it was serious racing, and it suited his aggressive, late-braking, I'll send it style. He also dabbled in the All-Star Speed Car series in the Middle East, popped up at Le Mans, and one of those more surreal later chapters of his career, entered the Indy 500 in 2012 as a 47-year-old rookie. The car was nowhere near the pace, and he retired early. But it was peak Alesi. If there was a racing car and a challenge, he wanted to feel it. Since 2013, he's been a brand ambassador for Pirelli, visible around the paddock as the eternally smiling elder statesman, the guy everyone seems to like. In 2006, France made him a Knight of the Legion of Honor, a pretty decent consolation prize for never getting the big trophy he chased for so long. So how good was Jean Alesi really? That's the question that hangs over his career. The numbers say one-time winner, lots of podiums, no titles. The footage says something completely different. Watch him at Phoenix in 1990, or in the rain at Barcelona 92, or hustling that Monza 94 Ferrari, or threading the Sauber through the spray at Spa in 1998. There's a raw, almost wild car control. The rear of the car always just sat on the edge of breaking away, the steering wheel never still. He drove with his heart, sometimes more than his head, and that cost him consistency. But it gave us moments that still get replayed whenever people feel nostalgic for proper racing. He was also, by all accounts, a fantastic teammate. Gerhard Berger, no stranger to either speed or chaos, later said, "Yeah, we were good mates. We're still friends. Have been since our days together in Formula 1. I like him very much. We help each other whenever we can. That day he made a big impression on me." You can feel the warmth when they're interviewed together. Alesi laughing, gesturing, telling stories about broken cars, crazy tests, and of course with Gerhard, practical jokes that would give modern PR departments a nervous breakdown. And then there's Senna. After that Phoenix duel in 1990, Ayrton didn't just pat the kid on the head and move on. He said John had the ingredients to be world champion. And coming from Senna, a man who was brutally, almost obsessively serious about who he rated, that's an extraordinary compliment. It's also the most Jean Alesi thing ever. One of the greatest of all time saying he had the tools in a career where the circumstances, the timing, and sometimes Jean himself never quite managed to assemble those tools into a title. But maybe that's why people still love him. Alesi represents a version of Formula One that wasn't just about efficiency and domination. It was imperfect, emotional, stubborn, sometimes his own worst enemy. He turned down the path that probably leads to easy championships with Williams because his heart said Ferrari. He stuck it out through the truck Ferraris, the broken gearboxes, the politics and the false dawns, because he believed that one day it would all click. And when it finally did, in Montreal, the image we're left with is not a controlled, polished champion. It's a man who has given everything, finally getting one day in the sun and literally running out of fuel on his way back to the pits. If you're a fan of the Racing Chronicles, you probably already know this channel doesn't just care about how many trophies someone's lifted. It's about the way they made you feel when you watch them. Jean Alesi is one of those drivers whose legacy isn't written in the numbers, but in the goosebumps, in Tifosi tears, in grainy replays of a Tyrrell hassling Ayrton Senna on a bumpy American street circuit. He was never world champion, but for a lot of people, he'll always be something else. The embodiment of what happens when pure talent, wild passion, and cruel timing collide. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of the Racing Chronicles. We've got plenty more stories coming your way, so stay tuned for the next chapter in racing history. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.